Alexandria, Egypt, around 240 years before the birth of Christ. A man named Eratosthenes walks out into the morning with 2 sticks and a question no one in the ancient world had yet answered with precision. How large is the earth? By the end of that day, using nothing but sunlight and geometry, he would have his answer correct to within 1% of the figure we use today. Eratosthenes was the chief librarian of the Library of Alexandria, and calculating the circumference of the earth was not even close to the most remarkable thing that institution produced. Aristarchus proposed that the earth orbits the sun 17 centuries before Copernicus. Hero of Alexandria built a working steam engine. Eratosthenes mapped the known world. These men were not isolated geniuses. They were products of one institution in one city, funded by one dynasty of kings. The Library of Alexandria was not a place that stored knowledge. It was a place that generated it, and what was lost when it ended was not scrolls. It was the machine that made all of them possible. 323 years before the birth of Christ, Alexander the Great died in Babylon. He was 32 years old. In 11 years of relentless campaigning, he had built the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen, stretching from Macedonia in the west to the edges of India in the east, and he had left no clear successor, no plan, no heir with the power to hold it together. What followed was chaos. Alexander's generals, the men who had marched beside him across 3 continents and watched him take everything from the Persians, now turned on each other. They are known to history as the Diadochi, a Greek word meaning successors. For decades they fought, negotiated, betrayed, and fought again. The empire Alexander had spent his life building began to fracture almost immediately after his body grew cold. Among those generals was a man named Ptolemy. He was one of Alexander's closest companions, a trusted officer, a skilled administrator, and by all accounts, one of the shrewdest political minds of his generation. When the empire was first divided, Ptolemy received Egypt as his share. On the surface, this was a remarkable prize. Egypt was the wealthiest province in the ancient world, a land of extraordinary agricultural abundance, fed by the Nile and coveted by every power that bordered it. But wealth and a problem came together. Ptolemy was Greek. His officers were Greek. The ruling class he was building was Greek, and Egypt was not. It was one of the oldest civilizations on earth, with a priestly class, a cultural memory, and a sense of its own identity that stretched back thousands of years. For Ptolemy to rule Egypt with any lasting stability, he needed something more than an army. He needed legitimacy, and legitimacy in the ancient world was not simply declared. It had to be constructed. His first move was audacious. In 321 BC, as Alexander's body was being transported by elaborate funeral procession from Babylon back toward Macedonia, Ptolemy intervened. He bribed the escort, diverted the procession, and brought the body south into Egypt, first to Memphis and later to Alexandria. To a modern eye, this reads as an act of audacious theft. In the ancient world, it was a masterstroke. Whoever held Alexander's remains held the closest thing to divine authority that the Greek-speaking world possessed. The reaction was immediate. Perdiccas, who served as regent of the fractured empire and had his own ambitions for Alexander's legacy, launched an invasion of Egypt in the same year. He intended to take the body back and reassert his authority over Ptolemy. But the campaign was a disaster. His forces could not cross the Nile. His own officers, frustrated and resentful, turned against him. Perdiccas did not survive the campaign. Ptolemy had held Egypt, held the body, and survived. The lesson was not lost on him. Power in this new world was not just military. It was symbolic. It was narrative. It was about who could most convincingly claim to be the inheritor of Alexander's greatness. And Ptolemy was a man who understood that such claims required constant, visible, expensive maintenance. The body in the tomb was a beginning. It was not enough. He declared himself king of Egypt in 305 BC, taking the title Ptolemy I Soter, Ptolemy the Savior. The choice of epithet was deliberate. He was not merely a conqueror, he was a protector, a restorer, a man who had saved Egypt from chaos and brought it stability. Whether the millions of Egyptians he now ruled shared that view was another matter entirely. But the framing was in place, and the dynasty that would carry his name for nearly 3 centuries had begun. Alexandria itself had been founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BC on a narrow strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and Lake Mareotis. The site had once been little more than a small Egyptian fishing village called Rhakotis. Alexander chose it for its natural harbors, its access to trade routes, and its strategic position on the western edge of the Nile Delta. His architect, Dinocrates of Rhodes, laid the city out on a precise grid of broad avenues crossing at right angles, a declaration of Greek order imposed on Egyptian soil. Alexander himself never saw the city completed. He left Egypt within months of its founding and never returned, dying far to the east before the great metropolis bearing his name had risen above its foundations. It fell to Ptolemy to complete what Alexander had sketched, and to understand what Alexandria could become in the right hands. What Ptolemy grasped, and what Alexander had perhaps only intuited, was that this city had the potential to be something entirely without precedent in the ancient world. The Mediterranean of the 3rd century BC was a world of competing powers, each claiming cultural authority in different ways. The Antigonid kingdom in Macedonia claimed the original Hellenic homeland. The Seleucid Empire in the east could point to its vast territorial inheritance. But Egypt under the Ptolemies had something none of the others possessed: resources. The Nile Valley was the ancient world's breadbasket, and whoever controlled it controlled the grain that fed half the Mediterranean. Ptolemy had money in quantities that his rivals could not match. The question was what to do with it. A lesser ruler would have built walls and warships and left it at that. Ptolemy I had a different instinct, one that would define his dynasty for generations. He understood that military power alone could not make Alexandria the center of the world. To do that, he needed to make it the place where the most important work of the age was being done. Not the most important fighting, the most important thinking. This instinct was not purely idealistic. It was calculating. In the Greek-speaking world, intellectual prestige was a form of political authority. The city that housed the greatest scholars, produced the greatest texts, and settled the great questions of literature, philosophy, science, and mathematics would carry a weight that no army could provide. It would attract the educated, the ambitious, and the capable from across the Mediterranean. It would make other rulers look provincial by comparison. There was a model for this kind of institution. Aristotle, whose student Alexander had run a school in Athens called the Lyceum, a place where philosophers and scientists gathered to argue, teach, and write. It was a small operation by any measure, dependent on private patronage and the goodwill of the city, but it had produced some of the most consequential thinking of the age. Ptolemy wanted something on a different scale entirely. He wanted the Lyceum reimagined as an act of state power. The man he turned to for counsel was Demetrius of Phaleron, a former Athenian statesman and philosopher who had studied under Aristotle's own successor, Theophrastus. Demetrius had been driven out of Athens by political enemies and had arrived in Alexandria seeking refuge at the royal court. He brought with him a detailed knowledge of how Athenian intellectual life had been organized and an understanding of what it would take to build something lasting. His advice to Ptolemy was direct: to gather all the books of the world in one place, and to house in the same institution the scholars capable of understanding them. This was the intellectual seed of what would become the Library of Alexandria. What Ptolemy was being asked to consider was not a library in any familiar sense. It was a research institution, a scholars' campus, a state-funded community of thinkers accountable to no one except the king and their own best judgment. Nothing like it had existed at this scale in the ancient world. Ptolemy committed to it with the same strategic clarity he had brought to every other instrument of his rule. By the time Ptolemy I died in 283 BC, Alexandria was already well on its way to becoming what he had imagined. His son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, inherited both the throne and the project, and would prove an even more enthusiastic patron of the institution taking shape at the heart of the city. The library and the Mausoleum, the research campus that housed it, were built in earnest under his reign. A dynasty had planted the seed. Now it would build the machine. What that machine would eventually produce, and how it would eventually be lost, is a story that begins not with scrolls or fires, but with a deliberate political choice made by a Macedonian general, who understood that in the long competition for the ancient world's attention, the city that controlled knowledge would outlast every city that merely controlled land. Ptolemy I did not love learning. He weaponized it, and in doing so, he built something that would outlive every weapon he ever carried. The institution that Ptolemy I set in motion and his son Ptolemy II brought fully to life was given a name rooted in the oldest traditions of Greek culture. It was called the Motion, the shrine of the Muses, the 9 goddesses of the arts and learning. The word would eventually pass into English as museum. But the Motion of Alexandria was nothing like any museum the modern world would recognize. It was not a place of display, it was a place of work. The Motion was built as part of the royal palace complex in the Brucheion quarter of Alexandria, the wealthiest and most carefully designed district of the city. It sat close to the harbor, close to the seat of royal power, and close to the great docks where ships from across the Mediterranean arrived daily. This proximity was not incidental. The kings who built it wanted the institution at the center of everything, visible, accessible, and impossible to overlook. The geographer Strabo, who visited Alexandria around 20 BC, left the most detailed surviving description of what the Motion looked like. He describes a complex of richly decorated buildings connected by colonnaded walkways, with a large communal dining hall at its heart, where the scholars who lived and worked there shared their meals together. There were lecture halls, open courtyards, and gardens. There were covered walkways where arguments could be conducted at length without interruption. Strabo's description makes clear that the Motion was not simply a building, it was a campus, a self-contained community of scholars, fed by the royal kitchen, housed within the palace precinct, and freed from every material obligation that might otherwise pull a thinking person away from thought. The men who lived there did not pay rent, they did not pay taxes. They did not need to find students to tutor or patrons to flatter. Their salaries came from the king, and their only obligation was to pursue the work they had been brought to Alexandria to do. This was the Ptolemaic bargain, and it was extraordinary. In the ancient world, scholars generally worked at the margins of economic life, teaching the sons of wealthy families, attaching themselves to the courts of rulers who might or might not prove reliable, or scraping by on the proceeds of their own writing. The Motion abolished that precariousness entirely. To be appointed to its staff was to be permanently freed from the anxiety of survival. The kings had purchased, with the full weight of Egypt's agricultural wealth, the conditions under which genuine intellectual work becomes possible. The collection of scrolls that occupied a dedicated building adjacent to the Motion was placed under the authority of a head librarian appointed by the royal court and serving for life. This was not an administrative post. Each head librarian during the Ptolemaic period was a scholar of proven distinction, a person who had already made an original contribution to their field before being appointed. The position combined curatorial authority over the greatest collection of texts in the world, with the intellectual standing to use that collection. The first head librarian was Zenodotus of Ephesus, appointed under Ptolemy II. He was primarily a scholar of Greek literature, and his work on establishing authoritative texts of Homer set the terms for all subsequent editing of the great epics. More significantly for the institution itself, Zenodotus introduced a system of alphabetical organization to the library's holdings. The first known instance of alphabetical cataloging in history. Books found through a system, rather than through memory, could be found by anyone. The library became navigable, but navigating the collection required first building it. And building it required a policy of acquisition more aggressive than anything the ancient world had seen. From the earliest years of the library's operation, the Ptolemies sent book agents out across the Mediterranean, to Athens, to Rhodes, to the great cities of Asia Minor, with instructions and funds to purchase any text they could find. Older works were particularly prized, on the grounds that they were less likely to have accumulated scribal errors through repeated copying. The agents purchased what they could. What they could not purchase, the kings found other means to obtain. Any ship docking in the harbor of Alexandria was subject to search. If books were found on board, they were taken to the library, copied by the institution's scribes, and the copies returned to their owners while the originals were retained. The confiscated books were catalogued with a specific notation, books from boats, so that scholars would know the provenance of what they were. Reading. Not every owner was satisfied with a copy in exchange for an original. Some tried to hide their libraries before entering the harbor. A black market in forged old copies grew up around the policy, as merchants attempted to pass off recently made scrolls as ancient originals that would command higher purchase prices from the library's agents. The pursuit of texts had become, under the Ptolemies, an economic force in its own right, distorting markets, creating new forms of fraud, and generating an industry of copying and annotation across the Mediterranean world. Under Ptolemy III Euergetes, who ruled from 246 to 221 BC, the acquisition policy reached its most brazen expression. Ptolemy III ordered agents to board every ship in the harbor, not merely those that happened to be carrying books, but every vessel without exception. The results were catalogued, the originals absorbed into the collection, and the copies returned. In a single reign, the library's holdings grew at a rate that no subsequent institution would match for over 1,000 years. The most celebrated story of Ptolemaic book acquisition concerns Ptolemy III and the great Athenian tragedians. He approached the authorities of Athens with a proposal. He would borrow the official state copies of the plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, the authoritative originals held in Athens as objects of cultural prestige for the purpose of making copies. As security, he deposited 15 talents of silver, an enormous sum. Athens agreed. The plays were sent to Alexandria. What happened next was a calculated breach of the agreement. Ptolemy III had the plays copied on the finest papyrus available. He then sent the copies back to Athens, kept the originals, and told the Athenians they could keep the 15 talents. The message was plain. The money was a small price for the greatest dramatic texts of the Greek world. Athens had no army that could make him return them. The originals remained in Alexandria, and the Athenians were left holding silver and copies. The library's ambition was not limited to Greek texts. The stated goal from the earliest years of its operation was to collect all the written knowledge of the world. Egyptian texts were gathered and translated. The Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek at Alexandria during this period, producing the version known as the Septuagint, a translation of enormous subsequent importance to both Judaism and Christianity. Persian texts were sought. There are references to Indian works entering the collection. The library was, in its conception, a universal archive without precedent. The scale of what was assembled is disputed by scholars, but the estimates from ancient sources cluster around an extraordinary figure. At its height, the library is said to have held somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls. To grasp what that meant in practice, a single substantial work of Greek literature might occupy a dozen scrolls or more. The library held not just the texts themselves but variant manuscripts, commentaries, critical editions, and translations. It was a layered archive, not a simple list. The Mausch itself, by the time it reached full operation under the early Ptolemies, employed over 100 scholars simultaneously. They worked across what we would now call separate disciplines: mathematics, astronomy, medicine, geography, literary criticism, philosophy, and the natural sciences. But the Mausion did not organize them by discipline in the modern sense. They ate together, walked together in the colonnades, and argued across the lines that would later separate the fields of knowledge into compartments. The institution was built for collision. The head librarian presided over all of this, appointed for life by the king, accountable in the last instance to royal authority, but in daily practice the intellectual sovereign of the most important collection of knowledge in the ancient world. It was a role unlike any other in the ancient world, combining the curatorial, the administrative, and the scholarly in a single person of documented distinction. The men who held it were not functionaries. They were the most accomplished minds of their generation. By the middle of the 3rd century BC, the Library of Alexandria and the Mausion had become exactly what Ptolemy I had intended, the undisputed intellectual center of the Greek-speaking world. Scholars came from Athens, from Syracuse, from the cities of Asia Minor and the shores of the Black Sea. To be appointed to the Mausion was the highest recognition the ancient world could offer a person of learning, and the kings who funded it understood that the prestige of the institution reflected directly on the prestige of the dynasty. The machine was built. The question was what it would make. It is worth pausing here to consider what was genuinely novel about this arrangement. Universities, research institutions, state-funded academies, these things exist in the modern world in such abundance that it requires an active imagination to understand how completely without precedent the Mausian was in its own time. There was no other institution in the ancient world that paid full scholars say to do nothing but think. There was no other collection of texts in the world remotely approaching its scale. What the Ptolemies had built was not an improvement on existing models, it was a new thing entirely. The names of the men who would work inside it over the next 2 centuries are among the most consequential in the history of human thought. They would calculate the shape of the Earth, propose the structure of the solar system, lay the foundations of geometry, map the known world, and advance the understanding of the human body to a point that would not be surpassed for over 1,000 years. None of that had happened yet. The collection was growing, the scholars were arriving, the machine that would produce all of it was, at last, fully operational. To understand what the Library of Alexandria actually produced, it helps to begin with the men who ran it. The head librarians of the Ptolemaic period were not administrators. They were the most accomplished scholars of their generation, appointed for life, accountable to the king, and given the full resources of the greatest collection of texts in the ancient world to work with. What they did with that position changed the course of human knowledge in ways that are still felt today. The first of them was Zenodotus of Ephesus, appointed around 284 BC under Ptolemy II. He arrived at a collection that was already vast and almost entirely unnavigable. Books were gathered in enormous quantities, but finding any specific text required knowing where it was. Zenodotus introduced the solution that still organizes every library on Earth. He arranged the collection alphabetically with a tag affixed to each scroll recording its author, title, and subject. The modern card catalog begins here, but Zenodotus's more lasting contribution was to the texts themselves. He turned to Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the foundational texts of Greek culture, which had been copied and recopied for centuries across dozens of different cities, each version carrying its own variants, errors, and interpolations. The library held 20 or 30 different editions of Homer. Zenodotus compared them against each other systematically, marked doubtful lines with a special symbol, and divided both epics into 24 books each. He invented the discipline now called textual criticism. While Zenodotus ran the library, a poet and scholar named Callimachus of Cyrene was working inside the Mausian on a project of a different kind. Callimachus was never appointed head librarian, a slight he felt keenly, and which contributed to a decades-long feud with his own student, Apollonius of Rhodes. But the work he produced made him one of the most important figures in the history of organized knowledge. His great project was the Pinakes, a title meaning simply tablets or lists. The Pinakes was a comprehensive bibliographic catalog of all known Greek literature, organized by genre and by author, with short biographical notices and notes on the contents of each work. It ran to 120 scrolls, 5 times the length of the Iliad. It was the first systematic attempt in history to survey the totality of a literary tradition, and it served as the foundation for the study of Greek literature for the rest of antiquity. The Pinakes was not merely a list, it made arguments. Callimachus identified which texts were genuinely ancient and which were later forgeries. He noted variant attributions, disputed authorship, and flagged texts that existed in multiple versions. He was, in the modern sense, a bibliographer, someone who treats books not just as containers of content but as objects with histories, provenances, and relationships to each other. The discipline of literary scholarship, in the form we still practice it, begins with Callimachus and the Pinakes. The second head librarian was Apollonius of Rhodes, the same man whose feud with Callimachus had simmered through years of proximity at the Mausian. Apollonius was a poet of genuine ambition. His most celebrated work, the Argonautica, was a full-scale epic poem on the voyage of Jason and the Argonauts, written deliberately in the tradition of Homer in conscious defiance of Callimachus's view that the long epic was a dead form. The head librarian of the greatest collection in the ancient world had written a new epic. The institution had produced literature, not merely preserved it. The feud between Callimachus and Apollonius was not simply personal. It was an argument about what literature should do, whether poetry should be long and heroic in the manner of Homer, or short and refined in the manner Callimachus advocated. That argument, conducted between two men eating in the same dining hall and walking the same colonnaded paths, produced some of the most technically sophisticated poetry of the ancient world. The institution did not just house scholars. It made their arguments more consequential by putting the right minds in the same space. The third head librarian was Eratosthenes of Cyrene. Appointed around 235 BC, he was in some ways the most representative product the Mausian ever generated, a polymath of extraordinary range working simultaneously across geography, mathematics, astronomy, history, literary criticism, and philosophy. His detractors, acknowledging his breadth while doubting his depth in any single field, called him Beta, the second letter of the Greek alphabet, meaning he was second best at everything. His achievements suggest they were wrong. Eratosthenes had read in a book held in the library of a well in the city of Sine in southern Egypt with a remarkable property. At noon on the summer solstice, sunlight reached all the way to its bottom, casting no shadow. This meant the sun was directly overhead at Syene at that moment. In Alexandria, Eratosthenes knew the sun was not directly overhead at the same time. It cast a shadow. The angle of that shadow, measured at noon on the summer solstice, was approximately 7.2 degrees, 1/50th of a full circle. The conclusion was geometrically inevitable. If the sun's rays arrived in parallel and the same sun cast no shadow in Syene while casting a shadow of 1/50th of a circle in Alexandria, then Alexandria and Syene were separated by 1/50th of the Earth's total circumference. Eratosthenes knew the approximate distance between the two cities. He multiplied it by 50. His result, approximately 40,000 kilometers, differs from the modern accepted figure by less than 1%. He had calculated the size of the Earth using geometry, a traveler's report about a well, and the length of a shadow. The method is as important as the result. Eratosthenes did not claim to have walked around the Earth or sailed its oceans. He reasoned from available evidence, a report in a book, a geometric principle, a measurement he could make himself, to a conclusion about the physical world. This is the scientific method, applied with complete rigor in the 3rd century before Christ. And it was not a solitary act of genius. It was the product of a man who had access to the library's collection, the Mausians' community of fellow thinkers, and the funded freedom to pursue the question wherever it led. Eratosthenes did not stop at the circumference of the Earth. He drew the first map of the known world using a system of parallel and perpendicular lines, the prototype of the modern grid of longitude and latitude. He calculated the tilt of the Earth's axis relative to the plane of its orbit with remarkable accuracy. He devised the method for calculating leap years that remains in use in modified form to this day. He wrote on geography, history, literary criticism, and the measurement of astronomical distances. In every field he entered, he left something that those who came after him were required to engage with. What made all of this possible was not Eratosthenes alone. It was the institution behind him. The report about the well in Syene was in a book held by the library. The geometric principles he applied had been formalized by Euclid, who had worked in Alexandria a generation earlier. The freedom to spend years pursuing questions with no immediate practical application was guaranteed by the Ptolemaic salary. Eratosthenes was a product of the machine in the most precise sense. The machine had assembled the knowledge he needed, housed the colleagues he argued with, and bought the time he worked in. The fourth head librarian was Aristophanes of Byzantium. Appointed around 195 BC, he continued the work Zenodotus had begun on establishing authoritative texts of the Greek poets and introduced a system of diacritical marks, notations added above or beside letters to indicate pronunciation, stress, and meter that became the standard for Greek writing and survive in the modern Greek alphabet. He also invented the practice of dividing poetic texts into metrical lines for the page, giving poetry the visual form it has had ever since. The fifth and final great librarian of the Ptolemaic period was Aristarchus of Samothrace, appointed around 150 BC. He is considered the greatest textual scholar the ancient world produced. His critical editions of Homer, Hesiod, Pindar, and the Athenian dramatists set standards of rigor that shaped the transmission of Greek literature for centuries. More than 800 critical commentaries are attributed to him. He was, in the fullest sense, the person who decided what Greek literature looked like for everyone who came after him. The sequence of these 5 men spans roughly 140 years. In that time, the Library of Alexandria invented textual criticism, produced the first comprehensive literary bibliography in history, generated a new epic poem, calculated the circumference of the earth, invented geographical mapping, devised the modern system of poetic notation, and established the authoritative texts of the Greek literary tradition. Each of these things was produced inside one institution, funded by one dynasty, in one city on the Egyptian coast. The machine was working exactly as designed. It is worth noting what the head librarians shared beyond their individual brilliance. Each of them had been trained partly by the generation before them. Apollonius was a student of Callimachus. Eratosthenes likely studied under Callimachus as well. They argued with each other, built on each other's work, and in some cases directly corrected each other's conclusions. Aristarchus spent a portion of his career refuting Zenodotus's readings of Homer. The institution created not just individual scholars but a continuous tradition of inquiry in which each generation inherited the problems of the last. This continuity is what distinguishes the Mautian from every other center of learning in the ancient world. Athens had produced brilliant philosophers, but Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum depended on individual patronage and institutional arrangements that did not survive their founders by more than a generation. The Mautian survived changes of king, changes of dynasty, and the political turbulence of 3 centuries because it was embedded in the machinery of the Egyptian state. Its survival was structural, not personal. The scholars who passed through it were not merely brilliant individuals. They were nodes in a network, connected to the collection below them, to the colleagues beside them, and to the tradition of scholarship that preceded and would follow them. The Library of Alexandria, at the height of its power, was not a building. It was a living system of inherited and contested and extended knowledge, and the men who ran it were not its guardians. They were its products and its proof. What had been assembled in Alexandria by the middle of the 2nd century BC was something the ancient world had never seen and would not see again. A self-sustaining intellectual tradition housed in an institution with the resources to maintain it and the structure to pass it on. The head librarians were its most visible expression. But they were surrounded, at every point in the Mautians' history, by other scholars whose work was equally consequential and whose names deserved the same attention. Those scholars, the residents of the Mauseion, who held no administrative title but whose work defined the limits of ancient knowledge, are the subject of what follows: Euclid, Aristarchus of Samos, Herophilus, Hipparchus, men who worked inside the machine, produced inside it, and whose achievements, examined one by one, make the question of what was lost when the machine ended feel not like an abstraction but like a series of specific, irreversible, entirely preventable disappearances. Each of them was a product of the same conditions: access to the largest collection of existing knowledge in the world, proximity to colleagues working across every discipline simultaneously, and the funded freedom to follow a question to its conclusion without worrying about where the next meal was coming from. Strip away any one of those conditions and the work changes. Strip away all 3, and it is difficult to imagine most of it happening at all. The Library of Alexandria did not produce genius. It produced the conditions under which genius could do what it could not do alone. That is what the Ptolemies had built, and that is what, over the following centuries, would be methodically, if quietly, and without drama, taken away. The head librarians are the most visible record of what the Library of Alexandria produced. But the institution was always larger than its administrators. Around and alongside the librarians, working in the same colonnaded halls and eating at the same communal tables, was a shifting community of resident scholars whose output, taken together, represents the most concentrated burst of intellectual production in the ancient world. Their names deserve as much attention as the fires that eventually consumed their work. Euclid of Alexandria worked at the Maushon around 300 BC, in the institution's earliest and most energetic years. Almost nothing is known about his personal life, where he was born, how he died, what he looked like. What survives is his work, and specifically one work above all others, The Elements, a systematic treatment of geometry in 13 books. It was completed in Alexandria, in the intellectual environment the Ptolemies had built, and it became the most successful mathematics textbook in history. The Elements is not primarily a collection of new discoveries. Euclid's genius was organizational. He took the accumulated geometric knowledge of the Greek world, theorems proved by a dozen different mathematicians over 2 centuries, and arranged them into a single logical structure, beginning with 5 simple axioms and building through 465 propositions, each one proved from what came before. The result was a system so rigorous and so complete that it remained the standard treatment of geometry for more than 2,000 years. Its reach was extraordinary. The Elements was translated into Arabic in the 8th century, into Latin in the 12th, and into dozens of European languages as printing spread. It shaped the mathematical education of Isaac Newton, René Descartes, and Albert Einstein, who called his copy as a boy the holy little geometry book. When modern mathematics finally moved beyond Euclidean geometry in the 19th century, it did so by building on foundations Euclid had laid in Alexandria around 300 BC. Working at roughly the same time as Euclid, a physician named Herophilus of Chalcedon arrived in Alexandria and began doing something that almost no one in the ancient world had done before. He systematically opened human bodies to understand how they worked. In most of the ancient world, the treatment of human remains was bound by religious and cultural prohibitions that made dissection unthinkable. In Alexandria, under Ptolemaic patronage, those prohibitions were temporarily lifted. Herophilus used the opportunity with extraordinary precision. What Herophilus found inside the human body overturned assumptions that had governed medicine for generations. Aristotle had placed the seat of intelligence in the heart. Herophilus dissected the brain, examined its ventricles, traced the nerves of the spinal cord back to their origin, and concluded that the brain was the center of the nervous system and the seat of human intelligence. He distinguished motor nerves from sensory nerves. He identified at least 7 pairs of cranial nerves. He described the duodenum and named it. The word he chose is still the word used in medicine today. Herophilus also worked alongside a younger colleague named Aristarchus of Chios, whose investigation extended further into the architecture of the human body. Eratosthenes came close to describing the circulation of the blood, an achievement that would not be formally accomplished until the English physician William Harvey in 1628, nearly 2,000 years later. The 2 men, working in Alexandria in the same brief window when human dissection was permitted, advanced the understanding of human anatomy to a point that the ancient world would not surpass and the medieval world would not reach again. The work of Herophilus and Eratosthenes illustrates something essential about the Mausians' role in the history of knowledge. Their discoveries were not the product of individual brilliance acting in isolation. They required a specific set of conditions, an institution that could obtain bodies for study, a city whose rulers were willing to permit practices that would have been impossible elsewhere, colleagues with whom results could be discussed and challenged, and a library whose holdings included every prior theory of human anatomy that needed to be tested and revised. Alexandria provided all of it simultaneously. Aristarchus of Samos arrived in Alexandria in the 3rd century BC and proposed an idea so far ahead of its time that the ancient world would spend the next 17 centuries pretending he had never said it. Working from geometric observations of the relative sizes and distances of the sun, moon, and earth, Aristarchus concluded that the sun was vastly larger than the earth and that the earth, not the sun, was the moving body. He proposed that the earth orbits the sun once a year while rotating on its own axis once a day. This was the heliocentric model of the solar system, stated with full mathematical reasoning in the 3rd century before Christ. 17 centuries later, Nicolaus Copernicus would be celebrated across Europe for proposing the same idea. Copernicus almost certainly knew of Aristarchus. References to the earlier astronomer survive in other ancient texts, and some historians believe he deliberately understated his debt to avoid the charge of reviving a discredited ancient theory. Aristarchus had been right and had been ignored. Copernicus was right and was heard. Why was Aristarchus ignored? Partly because Aristotle's authority over Greek natural philosophy was enormous, and Aristotle had argued for a geocentric universe. Partly because the heliocentric model seemed to require a stellar parallax, a measurable shift in the apparent positions of stars as the Earth moved that no ancient observer could detect, and partly because the mathematical tools needed to develop the model into a full predictive system of planetary motion had not yet been invented. Aristarchus had the right answer, but not yet all the tools to prove it. What makes the Aristarchus story so striking, in the context of the Library of Alexandria, is precisely that his work survived at all, not in its original form, which is lost, but in references by other ancient writers who had access to the Alexandrian collection. The institution preserved the record of an idea that the intellectual consensus of its time had rejected. That is a different and more subtle function than simply storing knowledge. The library kept open possibilities that the dominant theories of the age had tried to close. Hero of Alexandria worked in the 1st century of the Common Era, when the institution was already past its greatest years, but still functioning. He was a mathematician, engineer, and teacher at the Moutian, a man of extraordinary practical ingenuity who approached the physical world as a series of problems to be solved by careful observation and mechanical reasoning. His surviving writings describe more than 78 devices, covering pneumatics, automata, mechanics, and optics. The most famous of these is the eolipile, a hollow metal sphere mounted on an axle over a sealed vessel of water. When the water was heated, steam rose through pipes into the sphere and escaped through 2 bent tubes pointing in opposite directions. The escaping steam caused the sphere to spin. Hero had built a working steam-powered device in the 1st century of the Common Era. The Industrial Revolution would not begin for another 17 centuries. The principle involved, steam pressure converted into rotational motion, is identical to that of the engines that would eventually transform the world. Hero did not pursue it as an industrial instrument. The eolipile appears in his writings as a demonstration of physical principles and illustration of how steam behaves, used perhaps as a novelty or a theatrical device in temples, not as a source of productive power. Whether this reflects a failure of imagination on Hero's part, or simply the absence of the social and economic conditions that would have made industrial power useful, is a question historians still debate. What is not debatable is that the device worked, that it was forgotten, and that its rediscovery would have to wait for a different civilization in a different century. Hipparchus of Nicaea worked partly in Alexandria and partly on the island of Rhodes in the 2nd century BC. He is considered by many historians the greatest observational astronomer of antiquity, a man who measured the sky with a precision that would not be matched for over 1,000 years. He compiled the first comprehensive star catalogue in the Western world, recording the positions and apparent brightness of approximately 850 stars. He also discovered the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that causes the positions of stars, as seen from Earth, to shift gradually over time. His most consequential contribution to mathematics was the invention of trigonometry. Hipparchus needed a systematic way to calculate distances and angles in the sky, and the existing tools of Greek geometry were insufficient for the task. He constructed the first known trigonometric table, a list of values correlating angles to chord lengths, and used it to solve problems of spherical geometry that had previously been intractable. Every subsequent development in mathematics that depends on trigonometry, which includes most of the mathematics underlying navigation, physics, and engineering for the following 2 millennia, begins with this table, compiled in Alexandria and its neighboring island in the 2nd century BC. The last great scholar in the Alexandrian tradition was Hypatia, the daughter of Theon of Alexandria, himself the last known member of the Moutian. She was born around 350 to 370 AD At a time when the institution her father served was a shadow of what it had once been, and Alexandria itself was a city in profound religious and political transformation. She taught mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy, attracting students from across the Roman world, including both pagans and Christians, drawn by a reputation for extraordinary clarity and intellectual authority. Hypatia produced commentaries on the works of Diophantus and Apollonius of Perga that aided the preservation of those texts through the centuries that followed. She worked with her father on revised editions of Euclid's Elements and Ptolemy's astronomical writings, ensuring that the foundational texts of ancient mathematics and astronomy reached the medieval world in forms that scholars could use. She was not primarily a discoverer of new knowledge, but a transmitter and interpreter of the tradition that had been built across 5 centuries in Alexandria, in a city that was rapidly losing its capacity to do either. That work was not small. Hypatia's death in 415 AD, a violent end at the hands of those who saw her as a symbol of a tradition they wished to destroy, marked a turning point that those who witnessed it seemed to understand immediately. The departure of scholars from the city that followed was not simply a reaction to the event. It was the recognition that Alexandria was no longer a place where serious intellectual work was protected. The institution had already been declining for generations, but Hypatia's death made the decline visible and irreversible in a way that mere funding, withdrawal had not. Taken together, the scholars of the Library of Alexandria produced something that has no parallel in the ancient world. Euclid systematized mathematics. Herophilus and Aristarchus mapped the human body. Aristarchus described the solar system. Hero demonstrated the conversion of heat into motion. Hipparchus founded trigonometry and catalogued the sky. Eratosthenes measured the earth. Each of these achievements was produced inside the same institution, in the same city, within a span of roughly 500 years. No other institution in antiquity produced anything close to this record. What unites them, beyond the institution they shared, is the method they practiced. Each of them worked from evidence, from measurement, observation, and reasoning, rather than from inherited authority. Each of them was willing to follow a question to a conclusion that contradicted what respected predecessors had believed. And each of them was able to do this because the Mausian had assembled in one place both the full record of prior knowledge and the community of fellow thinkers whose challenges and objections sharpened every argument. The institution did not simply house brilliant people. It created the conditions under which brilliant people could be more brilliant than they could be alone. That is not a poetic claim, it is a structural one. Eratosthenes needed the library's collection to read the report about the well in Syene. Herophilus needed the Ptolemy's protection to dissect the human body. Euclid needed the accumulated idiometric tradition of the previous 2 centuries, gathered in one place to organize it into the elements. The machine was not incidental to the output. The machine was the reason for it. The tragedy of the Library of Alexandria is not that fire consumed these achievements. Most of what these men produced was copied, circulated, and survived in some form into the medieval period. The tragedy is something quieter and more specific. That the operating conditions that made the output possible, the funding, the protection, the institutional concentration of minds and materials, were dismantled piece by piece over the following centuries, and that no one who had the power to prevent that dismantling chose to do so. That story, the slow withdrawal of the conditions that make knowledge possible, begins in the 2nd century BC, gathers pace through the first centuries of Roman rule, and reaches its conclusion across the 300 years that follow. It is a story not about fire or conquest, but about institutional failure. And it is, for reasons that require no great effort of imagination, a story that feels uncomfortably familiar. The machine the Ptolemies built ran at full power for roughly 150 years. What came after was not destruction. It was something more commonplace and more difficult to mourn, the gradual, accelerating, entirely preventable decision to stop caring whether it kept running. The decline of the Library of Alexandria did not begin with a fire. It began with a political argument between 2 brothers and a king who decided that the scholars of his city had chosen the wrong side. The year was 145 BC. The institution had been at full power for roughly 150 years. What came next was not catastrophe. It was something quieter, and in its own way more damaging. The first serious withdrawal of the protection that had made the Mautian possible. Ptolemy VIII, known to contemporaries by the unflattering nickname Physcon, meaning pot-bellied, came to power after a prolonged and bloody struggle with his brother Ptolemy VI. Many of the scholars at the Mautian had supported the brother. Ptolemy VIII did not forget. In 145 BC, following his consolidation of power, he expelled every foreign scholar from Alexandria. Philologists, philosophers, physicians, mathematicians, geometers, painters, musicians, all of them driven out of the city by royal decree. Among those expelled was Aristarchus of Samothrace, the greatest textual scholar the ancient world had produced and the reigning head librarian of the Library of Alexandria. He fled to Cyprus, where he died in exile. A contemporary writer, Menecles of Barca, noted the unintended consequence of the purge. The expelled law scholars brought their learning to the Greeks and barbarians elsewhere, seeding intellectual life across the Mediterranean at the direct expense of the institution that had trained them. Alexandria's loss became everyone else's gain, but it was still a loss. The position of head librarian, for 2 centuries the most prestigious intellectual appointment in the ancient world, awarded only to scholars of documented distinction, was from this point forward given to political allies of the court rather than to persons of learning. The change was not dramatic. The institution continued to function. Books were still held. Scholars still worked. But the particular dynamic that had made the Mautian extraordinary, the guarantee that its leadership would always be driven by intellectual rather than political criteria, had been broken. It would not be restored. Under the later Ptolemies, the dynasty that had built the institution grew less interested in sustaining it. The ambition of Ptolemy I and Ptolemy III, the men who had seized books from ships, borrowed originals from Athens, and paid scholars to think rather than to teach, had no counterpart in the kings who followed. The later Ptolemies were weaker, more distracted, more consumed by the internal politics of a dynasty that was beginning its long decline. The institution did not disappear. It simply stopped being a priority. Rome absorbed Egypt in 30 BC with the death of Cleopatra VII, the last of the Ptolemies. The transition from Ptolemaic to Roman rule did not immediately destroy the Mautian. The early Roman emperors continued to fund it, understanding its symbolic value as part of Alexandria's prestige. The Emperor Claudius, in the 1st century of the Common Era, even built a new wing to house his own historical writings and arranged for them to be read aloud there twice a year. The institution persisted, but the nature of the support had changed. Under Roman patronage, the Mautian was no longer an institution that attracted the most ambitious scholars in the Mediterranean world. It was a maintained fixture of a great city valued for its prestige, funded at a level that kept it operational, but not driven by the kind of aggressive intellectual ambition that had produced Eratosthenes and Euclid. The geographer Strabo visited Alexandria around 20 BC and described the Mautian in his writings. He noted it still existed. What his words make clear, reading between the lines, is that it was no longer the institution it had been. The first violent incident most often associated with the library occurred in 48 BC, when Julius Caesar, besieged in Alexandria during the civil war that brought him and Cleopatra together against her brother Ptolemy XIII, ordered the enemy fleet in the harbor set alight to prevent its use against him. The fire spread beyond the ships. Ancient writers disagree about what it consumed. Seneca, citing an earlier historian, says 40,000 scrolls were destroyed. Modern scholarship suggests the fire most likely reached warehouses near the docks where scrolls were stored pending export, a significant loss, but not the destruction of the main collection. The Mautian itself, situated in the palace complex away from the harbor, almost certainly survived the fire of 48 BC. Strabo's visit roughly 30 years later confirms the institution was still standing. Mark Antony, in the years following the fire, reportedly gave Cleopatra a substantial collection of scrolls from the library at Pergamon to supplement whatever had been lost, though ancient sources disagree on the scale of this gift, and some historians doubt the entire story. What is clear is that ancient writers, for a century after Caesar's fire, continued to refer to the library as a functioning institution. The 3rd century of the Common Era was when the damage became structural and irreversible. The Roman Empire entered a period of sustained political and military crisis, a succession of short-lived emperors, provincial rebellions, economic contraction, and the constant pressure of external threats on multiple frontiers. The flow of imperial funding to cultural institutions across the empire contracted sharply. The Mautian, dependent on consistent royal or imperial patronage for its salaries, its building maintenance, its copying program, and its acquisitions, felt the withdrawal immediately. Scholars stopped arriving. Without the guarantee of a salary and the security of institutional protection, the brightest minds of the Mediterranean had no particular reason to come to Alexandria over any other city. Copying ceased. The collection, which had required constant maintenance to prevent the deterioration of papyrus scrolls in a humid coastal climate, began to shrink through neglect. Texts that were not recopied on new materials simply decayed. The collection that had taken 3 centuries and the full resources of the Egyptian state to assemble was being unmade quietly by the simple economics of institutional abandonment. In the 270s of the Common Era, the Roman Emperor Aurelian retook Alexandria after it had been occupied by the forces of Queen Zenobia of Palmyra. The fighting was severe. The Bruttian quarter, the royal district where the Mautian complex had stood for 4 centuries, was devastated. Whatever remained of the main library at this point almost certainly did not survive the reconquest intact. The institution that had been the intellectual center of the ancient world had, by this point, been reduced to a remnant. Aurelian's campaign likely ended even that. There was a second collection, smaller, always secondary but real, the Serapeum, the great temple of Serapis that stood on higher ground in a different part of Alexandria, had housed a daughter library since the time of Ptolemy III. Estimates placed its holdings at roughly 42,000 scrolls, a fraction of the main collection at its peak, but still a substantial archive. After the devastation of the Bruttian, whatever scholarly life remained in Alexandria centered on the Serapeum and its collection. In 365 AD, an earthquake and tsunami struck Alexandria with devastating force, damaging large portions of the city and accelerating the physical deterioration of the coastline. The royal quarter, where the original library buildings had stood, began to subside into the sea, a process that would eventually submerge the entire Bruttian district. The physical traces of the institutions to define the intellectual life of the ancient world were disappearing into the Mediterranean, literally and irreversibly. In 391 AD, the Roman Emperor Theodosius issued decrees against pagan practice across the empire. In Alexandria, the Patriarch Theophilus directed the destruction of the city's pagan temples. The Serapeum, the great temple of Serapis, which had housed the daughter library, was pulled down by a Christian mob and replaced with a church. Whether any collection of scrolls remained in the Serapeum at this point is debated by historians. Several ancient accounts of the destruction make no mention of books at all. The daughter library, if it had survived to this point, almost certainly did not survive this. The death of Hypatia in 415 AD was not the cause of Alexandria's intellectual decline. By the time she was attacked in the streets of the city, the institution that had made Alexandria the center of the ancient world had been gone for well over a century. But Hypatia represented something that the act of her death made unmistakable. The tradition she embodied, the tradition of rigorous, secular, evidence-based inquiry that the Mautian had practiced and protected for 5 centuries, was no longer safe in the city. The scholars who remained after her death understood the message, and many left. The Arab conquest of Egypt in 642 AD brought with it, centuries later, a famous story that the Caliph Umar, when asked what to do with the books remaining in Alexandria, replied that if they agreed with the Quran, they were unnecessary, and if they contradicted it, they were dangerous, and ordered them used as fuel for the city's bathhouses. The story appears in a Christian source written 600 years after the supposed event. Modern historians regard it as almost certainly legendary. By 642, there was in all probability very little left to burn. What the Arab conquest story reveals is not the history of the library's end, but the history of how people have preferred to think about it. The single dramatic moment of destruction, the fire, the fanatic, the catastrophic loss, is a story that makes sense of tragedy through agency and event. It gives the loss a shape. Someone did this. Something burned. There is a before and an after. The actual story of the Library of Alexandria's end has none of those satisfactions. It ended the way institutions almost always end, through the accumulation of smaller failures, the withdrawal of smaller commitments, and the gradual departure of the people who had made it worth sustaining. By the time of the Arab conquest, Alexandria was still a city, still a port, still a center of trade, still a place where philosophical and theological argument continued. But it had not been the intellectual center of the ancient world for 3 centuries. The scholars had left. The collections had rotted or been scattered. The buildings had been damaged, rebuilt in reduced form, damaged again. The Ptolemaic bargain, the state's commitment to funding the concentrated pursuit of knowledge as a matter of strategic priority, had been withdrawn so gradually that it is impossible to identify the moment when it ended. That gradual withdrawal is what distinguishes the end of the Library of Alexandria from the dramatic destruction that legend has substituted for it. Fire takes a night. Institutional abandonment takes generations. Fire produces ruins that can be pointed to and mourned. Institutional abandonment produces nothing. No rubble, no visible wound, only the quiet absence of things that used to be produced and no longer are. The Library of Alexandria ended not with a conflagration, but with a question no one in power thought worth answering. Is this still worth paying for? The answer, arrived at slowly and never stated explicitly, was no, and in that answer, unremarkable, bureaucratic, entirely without drama, the ancient world lost the only institution it had ever built that was specifically designed to make the best use of the best minds, not the texts, the operating conditions, not the scrolls, the system. What remained, what survived into the medieval world through Arabic translations, through the copying work of Byzantine monks, through the marginal notes of commentators working in reduced circumstances across the following centuries, was significant. Much of Euclid survived. Portions of Galen's medical writings, which drew on Herophilus and Aristarchus, survived. Ptolemy's astronomical synthesis survived and shaped Islamic astronomy for centuries. The tradition was not obliterated, but it was transmitted in fragments, stripped of the institutional context that had produced it, and dependent on the individual decisions of individual copyists rather than on the organized, funded, state-supported commitment to preservation that the Moshayan had once represented. The story told most often about the Library of Alexandria ends with fire. The one told here ends with something harder to picture, an absence. Not the absence of scrolls, many of them survived, in copies, in translations, in the marginal notes of medieval scholars who had read things we can no longer find. What was lost was the system that had produced them, and what the loss of that system meant for the history of humans' knowledge is not a question that can be answered in a single number or a single event. Begin with what survived. Euclid's elements reached the medieval world intact, first through Arabic translations made by scholars working in Baghdad in the 8th and 9th centuries of the Common Era, and later through Latin translations that would place it at the center of European mathematical education for another 600 years. The geometric tradition Euclid had systematized in Alexandria around 300 BC was still being taught, essentially unchanged, in European universities in the 19th century. Some things the library produced proved indestructible. The astronomical work of Hipparchus survived in fragments, and in the synthesis that Claudius Ptolemy produced in his Almagest, a 2nd century work that drew heavily on Hipparchus's star catalogue and trigonometric tables, and became, through its Arabic translation, the foundation of medieval Islamic astronomy. The very name Almagest is Arabic, a transliteration of the Greek title. The chain of transmission runs from the Maushon in Alexandria to the House of Wisdom in Baghdad to the universities of medieval Europe. A thread that held, improbably, across 1,000 years of political upheaval. The medical tradition of Herophilus and Aristarchus survived partly through the writings of the physician Galen, who worked in Rome in the 2nd century of the Common Era, and whose own work drew extensively on the Alexandrian anatomical tradition. Galen's writings, preserved in Arabic translation and later in Latin, shaped the teaching of medicine in European universities from the 12th century until the work of Andreas Vesalius in the 16th century reopened the practice of systematic human dissection that Herophilus had pioneered in Alexandria nearly 2,000 years earlier. The line from the Mausian to the Renaissance anatomist is longer than it looks, but it is unbroken. Hero of Alexandria's writings on pneumatics and mechanics survived in Greek manuscripts that were eventually translated into Arabic and then into Latin, bringing his descriptions of the eolipile to the attention of European engineers in the 16th century. The device was replicated as a curiosity. Its industrial application would wait another century and a half for James Watt and the conditions of 18th century England. The principal Hero had demonstrated in the first century of the Common Era was not forgotten, it was simply waiting for a world ready to use it. And Aristarchus? His original texts on the heliocentric model of the solar system did not survive. We know what he proposed because other ancient writers quoted him, argued with him, or noted his idea in passing. Archimedes mentioned his theory in the Sand Reckoner. Plutarch referred to it. These references are what survived, the shadows of an argument whose primary sources were lost. When Nicolaus Copernicus proposed the heliocentric model in the 16th century, and the European world began to absorb what it meant, the original proof that someone had stood in Alexandria 17 centuries earlier and reached the same conclusion was a footnote, not a foundation. The Pennices of Callimachus, the 120-scroll catalog of all known Greek literature, the first systematic bibliography in history, is gone. Fragments survive in quotations by later writers. What they reveal is a work of extraordinary scope and rigor, one that organized and described a body of literature far larger than what eventually reached us. The Pennices is also a catalog of what was lost, because everything it described that does not survive in some other form represents a text that entered the library, was cataloged, was held, was read by scholars who built their own work upon it, and then quietly ceased to exist as the copying stopped and the papyrus decayed. What the Pennices makes visible, even in fragments, is the scale of the specific losses, not totals or estimates but individual titles, works by named authors on identified subjects that we know existed because Callimachus recorded them and that we know are gone because no other source preserves them. The history of Greek comedy, large portions of Greek lyric poetry, works on natural philosophy, on mathematics, on geography, on medicine that are known only by title. The library held them. The system that maintained the library failed. They did not survive. None of this, however, is the deepest loss. The deepest loss is not the titles in the Pennices that have no surviving manuscripts. It is the structure that produced them. The Mausian was the ancient world's only institution specifically designed to concentrate the best minds, give them access to everything previously known, and pay them to extend that knowledge without constraint. When it ended, nothing like it existed anywhere in the world. The medieval world had monasteries, which preserved texts but were not designed to generate new knowledge. It had courts, which patronized poets and philosophers but did not fund sustained research. It had nothing that resembled the Mausian. The University of Bologna, founded in 1088 AD, is conventionally described as the oldest university in Europe. It was founded roughly 900 years after the Library of Alexandria began its decline. The University of Paris and the University of Oxford followed in the 12th and early 13th centuries. These institutions, the first genuinely organized centers of higher learning in the medieval Western world, were built on foundations that included, in crucial ways, the Alexandrian tradition transmitted through Arabic and Byzantine intermediaries. They inherited the legacy of the machine. But they were not themselves that machine. The European universities of the medieval period were places of teaching, institutions designed to transmit established knowledge to students, to train lawyers, theologians, and physicians, and to debate the interpretation of authoritative texts. The kind of open-ended, empirically grounded, state-funded inquiry that had characterized the Mausian at its peak, the pursuit of questions to which the answer was genuinely unknown, by people paid specifically to find it, would not fully reappear in the Western world until the founding of dedicated research institutions in the 18th and 19th centuries. The gap between the decline of the Mautian and the emergence of institutions that genuinely resembled it is not 100 years or 200 years. It is closer to 1,000. 1,000 years during which the tradition that had calculated the circumference of the Earth, proposed the heliocentric solar system, founded trigonometry, and advanced human anatomy to the limits of what naked eye observation could achieve, was preserved in fragments, transmitted through intermediaries, and kept alive by individual acts of scholarship rather than by any institution with the resources and the will to sustain it. The Islamic scholarly tradition deserves particular attention in this account because it is the tradition most responsible for ensuring that the Alexandrian legacy survived at all. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, established under the Abbasid Caliphate in the 8th and 9th centuries, became the greatest center of translation and scholarship in the medieval world. Scholars there translated Euclid, Galen, Ptolemy, Aristotle, and dozens of other Greek authors into Arabic, producing versions that preserved the content of works whose Greek originals were subsequently lost. Without the House of Wisdom, the transmission of ancient learning to medieval Europe would have been far thinner than it was. But the House of Wisdom, for all its extraordinary achievement, was not the Mautian. It was primarily a translation and preservation institution, one that received the legacy of Alexandria and passed it on, enriched and commented upon, to subsequent generations. The original research tradition of Alexandria, the commitment to generating new knowledge rather than transmitting existing knowledge, had no institutional successor in the ancient or early medieval world. It was, in the most precise sense, a one-time event. Return now to the specific figures at the heart of this story. Aristarchus of Samos proposed in the 3rd century BC that the Earth orbits the Sun. The proposal was ignored, his texts were lost, and the heliocentric model had to be independently recovered by Copernicus in 1543 AD, nearly 1800 years later. The question of whether the history of astronomy would have developed differently had Aristarchus's original arguments been preserved and built upon is genuinely unanswerable. But it is not an idle question. Hero of Alexandria built a working steam-powered device in the 1st century of the Common Era. The device was described in his writings, which survived. The Industrial Revolution, the event most transformative of human material life in the past 3 centuries, did not begin until the 18th century. Here the question is not about lost texts, but about lost momentum, whether the existence of a functioning, described, demonstrably working steam device in Alexandria in the 1st century AD could, under different institutional conditions, have led to industrial development 1,000 or 1,500 years earlier than it did. No one can say. But the device existed. The institutional conditions that might have developed it did not. These are not arguments that the Library of Alexandria, had it survived, would have produced an ancient industrial revolution or an ancient Copernican revolution. History does not work that way, and the social and material conditions that made those developments possible in the early modern period were not present in the ancient world. The argument is narrower and more specific, that the Mautian was the only institution in the ancient world capable of building systematically on the discoveries made inside it, and that when it ended, that capacity ended with it. What happened next was not continued progress at a slower pace. It was the loss of the operating conditions under which systematic progress was possible at all. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth in the 3rd century BC. That calculation was known, it was cited, it was admired, it was used, but it was not built upon in the way that the existence of the Mautian made possible. The institution that had produced it was gone. The scholars who might have extended the method, applied it to new questions, trained a generation of successors to improve on it. Those scholars had dispersed. The knowledge survived. The machinery for generating more knowledge did not. There is a way of telling the story of the Library of Alexandria that makes it a story about books, about scrolls that burned or rotted or were scattered, about titles in Callimachus's catalog that have no surviving manuscripts, about the texts of Aristarchus and Herophilus and the Panax itself. That story is true, and it matters. but it is the smaller story. The larger story is about an institution, about what it takes to build the conditions under which human knowledge advances systematically rather than in occasional bursts of individual genius, and about how completely and how quietly those conditions can be dismantled once the political will to maintain them is gone. The Library of Alexandria was built by kings who understood, for reasons of their own, that knowledge was worth the cost of a state investment. It was maintained, at varying levels of commitment, for roughly 3 centuries. It was then diminished, neglected, damaged, and eventually ended, not in one event but in the accumulation of smaller decisions made by people who had concluded that other things mattered more. The machine stopped because no one in authority decided it was worth keeping running. That is not a dramatic conclusion. It is the accurate one.